is the press briefing from the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say, and we are an independent, nonpartisan think tank on global issues based in Canada with a global perspective. We have 3 G20 experts here today to only make a very short introductory statement on some thoughts about how to interpret and how to look at the final communique from the G20 leaders coming this afternoon. And first to speak will be James Haley, our Director of the Global Economy Program and an economist with a background in the Canadian Public Service. Colin Bradford, who is based at Brookings as well. And Andy Cooper, and he's a CG Senior Fellow, and Andy Cooper is a CG Distinguished Fellow based in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. So we'll just get right into it, and then after the 3 opening statements, we'll be happy to take any questions, and the staff here can bring you a microphone so you can be heard. And there are translation earphones available too. Jim speaks French, I believe, and Colin speaks Spanish. So English on a good day. So we can take questions in French and Spanish as well. So I'll turn it over now to James Haley.
Great, thank you very much, Fred, and welcome to everyone. Going into this Los Cabos Summit, I think the key risks to the global economy were the continuing volatility, the continuing turmoil in Europe with respect to the Eurozone, weakening growth in China and India, Brazil, the key BRIC economies, and the uncertain pace of the US recovery. So I think those were the key risks, and looking forward to the final communique. G20 leaders would, I think, impart a reassuring message if in the communique they outline measures to deal with each of those 3 key risks. Most important, I think, obviously, is the Eurozone crisis, and I think a key measure that G20 leaders could identify here is steps to move towards a European banking union. And the basic message, as I blogged yesterday, is that Europe has created more or less complete monetary integration, but they haven't moved forward with the institutions that are required to support monetary union. And that has, I think, led to the continuing volatility, the continuing sense of crisis and uncertainty that looms over Europe and indeed the rest of the world. So a key outcome of this summit, I think, would be a clear statement that Europe is committed, determined to move forward in filling that governance gap, the need to build institutions to support monetary union. And that would be a very good outcome indeed. Colin?
Thank you very much. Just to pick up on what Jim said, let me just say that I think, you know, what you saw yesterday, if some of you were at the meeting with the press conference of President Jose Manuel Barroso and Herman Van Rompuy, is the interesting question at the end revealed a certain amount of anger on the part of Barroso in terms, the way I read that was that he was feeling the heat. He's feeling the pressure, right, to deliver precisely on the agenda that Jim's talking about. And, you know, he was returning the heat by saying that he expected the non-European G20 countries to reciprocate by expressing unqualified confidence in the Europeans to deliver what they've got to deliver and to manage the crisis and get through it. So I think that pressure is part of what this is all about, and conflict is what it reveals, and that's because there are serious domestic political constraints on what these leaders can do here. You know, it's quite clear watching the European thing unfold that the German parliament is a big factor in what is feasible in terms of the institutional solutions and big policy solutions that are out there, making the European Central Bank the lender of last resort, as an example, which simply isn't going to fly politically in Germany. So that's certainly one thing. Let me just flag 2 or 3 other things quickly, and we can go on to them during the question period. Another interesting thing here, I think, that's linked to this whole question of growth, the switch after Hollande's victory in France and the parliamentary elections there on Sunday, from an emphasis on austerity to an emphasis on a growth is this whole question of how do you link financial stability to growth. And that you'll see a report and a discussion that's going on right now, I think, on financial regulatory reform, and a report from the Financial Stability Board to the G20 about the progress countries are making on completing the Basel III agreements on financial regulatory reform. An interesting new side discussion there is that will follow that discussion on financial stability and financial regulation is financial inclusion. And the idea, the political idea, that financial markets have worsened income inequality is a relatively new idea that came into the general policy discourse a year ago or so when Dominique Strauss-Kahn was still head of the IMF. And he was one of the first people to begin to talk about it. I'll have to say that Kemal Dervish, who was former Minister of Finance of Turkey and who's now at Brookings, was another prominent voice on this. So that's a very interesting new issue, is how to deliver inclusion and greater equity in a financial markets which, if left to themselves, seem to be income disequalizing and exacerbating income inequality rather than solving it. Finally, on green growth, I would say keep an eye out for how much it seems to be a laundry list, which is on sustainable development, which is what we can expect, I think, from Rio, and how much of it is a focus. And the focus I would look for is there will be 3 billion new customers for energy on 2050 over the number of people who have electricity today, which is 5.6 billion. That's a 2/3 increase in the consumer base for electricity in the next 40 years. This means that the underlying sustainable development, sustainable growth issue, green growth issue, is energy. And it's going to be interesting to see the degree to which this more financially oriented, more economic forum of leaders focuses on that. Thank you.
The G20 is caught between being a steering group and a crisis committee. I think the host, President Calderon, wanted to move the G20 into the steering component. We can see that he was setting out an ambitious long-term agenda. Colin has mentioned green growth, but we could talk about a variety of other issues as well, including disaster management. Lots of buy-in from not only Mexico, but countries like Japan. But as in Cannes, and indeed perhaps the last 3 or 4 G20s, we've found that the G20 has been caught up in sort of crisis component, crisis committee work, unfinished business, and the moment of the time. Greece again, but other European problems as well. We can get into some of the outcomes, but I think one thing should be sort of a positive takeaway. Even if the G20 is caught between these two roles, it's become the accepted pivotal group, the sounding group, the focus group for the world. The legitimacy questions that we saw from London, from other G20s, have withered away. We don't find countries from outside having the same complaints. We do seem to have the right countries around the table talking about the right things. 2 sort of deliverables, I think, but maybe perhaps more questions from the deliverables than answers. One, of course, is IMF resources. And here we see that the BRICS have stepped up. We see the Chinese have offered 43 billion. We see the other BRIC countries, maybe accepting South Africa, have put in 10 billion. This is a good thing, not only for the globe, generosity, but also, I think, for global governance and the centerpiece of the G20. The question, of course, is what trade-offs this will be. We can see that the status component of the G20 is still very much there. The BRICS are going to want an acceleration of their quid pro quo for this component. The other, of course, is, as Jim has mentioned, banking union. And I think here we can see that the Germans, Chancellor Merkel, have been on the defensive and used perhaps an opportunity to go more on the offensive in this type of aspect, because we can see this opens up not only a huge debate in Germany, and I think we're beginning to see some changes in the debate about Germany in terms of, again, generosity for and solidarity for other countries rather than just the strict austerity measure, but also, of course, going into very uncharted waters, not only about sovereignty, but about the components of the technical details that, again, Jim and others can talk about in terms of what banking union actually means in practice. So once more, I think we've seen a country that probably hasn't been the leader in the past grabbing the mantle of leadership, at least in one specific area, where other countries, I think, have either stayed on the sidelines or indeed have been distracted by other issues, whether this is on Pacific trade, whether it's on Syria. We can see that really the focal point is Europe and other countries' reaction to the euro crisis. Thanks.
Yes, to Mr. Bradford. You were talking about Barroso's anger somehow yesterday.
We talking about what?
You were talking about Mr. Barroso's anger somehow yesterday. And we saw other examples of finger-pointing from the Europeans. Do you think that the missed meeting yesterday evening between Obama and the European has something to do with that?
Explain what happened. There was meant to be a dinner and they didn't.
Yeah, there was meant to be a meeting between EU and Barack Obama, but it didn't take place at the end.
I don't have any idea because I wasn't aware of it. But the dinner certainly was a G20 dinner in the end, right?
So after the dinner, there was supposed to be
a meeting,
another meeting, and it didn't take place. Or could you expand on this tensions between?
Yeah, I think tension. I guess the way we've come to think about it is, that there seems to be a problem of transiting from the G8 sort of mindset about what summits are about, which were definite climbings up to a peak moment in a given year, and that was sort of it. Now we have an ongoing sequence of summits. 2 weeks' time, there's another European summit. So, you have to adjust your expectations about what's going to happen here based on the fact that there's going to be another one, and then another one after that, and then the fall meetings of the fund and the bank, and then another, and another, and another. And different groupings also. And the other piece of it is that tension is a good thing. Conflict is a good thing. It's there. It's latent. And what you're seeing is that for the first time, I don't remember G7, G8 summits being like this at all. Is that what you see is it's visible what the differences are, what the tensions are, and it's visible what role parliaments have in it and what the domestic component of it is. Well, since that's the reality, the fact that it's visible is actually a little uglier than we might want it to be, but it's real. And so it means that what's happening is we're not just doing blah, blah here, right? Guys are working stuff out. And when somebody like as outstanding as President Barroso gets angry, it's actually a sign that there's some tension, some heat, something's happening. It's not just a glide.
Yeah, I think it's the paradox of the G20. When the G20 came into being, the European countries, and indeed the European Commission and the Council, rushed to be around the table, right? Even countries that were on the margins wanted in, including Spain, the Netherlands, and so on. So in some ways, we find the reverse now. The European Union has, with good reason, set itself up as a model of governance, soft power, a whole deal, in terms of lessons for the world. And now, of course, they're being criticized. So I don't think I would only see it as U.S., EU. I think the attention on the European, indeed the critical attention, goes well beyond the U.S. We see it with Bob Zellick, World Bank. We see it with certainly Canada in terms of getting the act together in terms of the European Union. And indeed, even countries like India, I think, pushing the Europeans to really deliver on a number of aspects. This is both the beauty of the the G20, because again, it has the right countries around the table. But the focus, attention on criticism have moved from these original criticisms of the U.S., that in some ways took the hit in 2000, 2008, 2009. The Europeans seem to be much more sensitive, much more unused to that sort of outside criticism. And I think unless they get their act together, that criticism is going to continue to come.
Yeah, I'll just add a very brief comment. And I think Andy's hit on a very important point in the sense that, what we're seeing is, in fact, the basic rationale for summitry and for international cooperation. In a globalized, integrated economy, such as the one that we've developed over the last several decades, policy failures in one country can spill over and affect other countries negatively. And those countries that are affected have a legitimate interest in sitting down and talking to the other country and asking them, imploring them, and expecting them to undertake measures that will resolve the source of the shock, the uncertainty. And I think that's what you're seeing. And I think that, as Colin mentioned, to some extent that's just natural, and that's a sign that people are working very, very diligently, very hard to try and resolve these problems.
Good morning. Ella Kokotsis, I'm with News Desk Media, based out of England. Question, one for James and one for Andy. James, you mentioned the importance of the G20 coming up with a statement on a banking union. And I'm wondering if you think this is really the place to do it, if the G20 should be making a statement on a banking union, or if that should be reserved for the European Summit, which is going to happen in a couple of weeks from now. And Andy, your point about IMF resources, you mentioned that the BRICS are stepping up and that's a good thing. What about this North American union that we're seeing between Obama and Harper, where they're pulling back and saying, the IMF is not the place, and really those funds need to be reserved for developing countries and not to bail out Europe. What are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I agree. I mean, I'm not so naive as to believe that the Eurozone members that are here can or will pre-commit their Eurozone partners to specific undertakings. I think that's quite natural not to expect that. But what I think is very important is a clear message that that they're aware of the severity of the situation and that measures will be coming. I think as we're seeing in the fallout from the Greek election, I mean, it was very welcome news, obviously, but it did not last. The relief rally did not last very long. That Spanish bond yields very quickly hit a euro area high, and so that, again, I think that's an indication of the extent to which there is this uncertainty that hangs over the global economy, that clouds economic prospects going forward. And as I say, there is a need for leaders, the G20, the Euro, at the European level, to start sending clear messages that this problem will be resolved, and the sooner the better.
Yeah, on the IMF question, I mean, I think this is why status has to be brought in. If we go back to Pittsburgh, there was a deal in terms of sort of a rearrangement of global governance. And even though certainly you can criticize China and other countries, I think the signal that they want to put more money in says that they want to have this quid pro quo. And I think this is the huge difference between Canada and perhaps other countries, that in some ways are defensive but also sort of status quo. Easy with their banking regulation, certainly don't feel the need to be overly generous with Europeans that have a fairly, not only adequate lifestyle, but in some ways a very golden lifestyle. So in that regard, I think the two different sections of the G20 are in very different situations. Canada isn't striving. I think they are striving to get into the Pacific free trade deal. And of course, that's where you see a very different type of diplomatic action taking place. and of course of new forms of coalitions that really force Canada to do things perhaps in a different way than they've done in the past. But once more, the BRICS, I think the central game for them is to get that trade-off in terms of global governance, and that, I think, is very much directing their approach.
I'd just quickly like to add just 2 points on both, one on each question. It does seem to me that European banking union measures should be mentioned here. It's legitimate that they be mentioned here because the rest of the globe has a stake in those things and therefore will want to see that specific reference. And that's exactly the point of the exercise, is to make, as Jim said, to make, the countries that are in crisis aware of the global, that the rest of the world is affected, and that they have two reasons for resolving. One is that for their own people, and the other is for for the global economy itself. So, and on the fund, I mean, to somehow try to ring fence the IMF and say that the IMF should be there for just developing countries seems to me completely in contradiction to the fact that the purpose of the IMF is to be the premier international system in the premier institution in the international monetary system, and to make it a global institution. And another place where there's heat on the Europeans right here in Los Cabos is to move the IMF reform forward so that the Europeans have 2 less seats than the 8 that they already have less shares than the third of the IMF shares that they already have, which is way out of proportion with their world GDP. And so why is it important to do that? Because from the point of view of the rest of the world and the emerging markets, the IMF does not look like a global institution in terms of its governance. It looks like a transatlantic institution. So you have to convert the governance of it into so that it has global representation. And you have to move it forward in terms of having enough resources so that it can play a global role in the global financial system, and not ring fence it around. Well, and the IMF has never really been a development institution, so it's the wrong moment to try to. And you've got something like, as Barroso said yesterday, you've got something like 40% of the funds that are being put into this increment of 400 billion is from Europe, and so. And it's a useful thing to have a global backup to the 2 European funds that already exist. So I think there's a lot of reasons. The theme is global, right? The theme isn't let's try to ring fence and contain problems.
To what extent do you think is the pressure from non-Europeans here at the G20 on Europe counterproductive, and perhaps leads Germany to harden its positions because it believes that it's been pursuing the right path all along, and everyone can go and do their own measures at home and stop asking Europe for what it needs to do, which is what Germany's argument is.
Who's your question? I mean, it's difficult to say. I think, clearly, as I mentioned earlier, the source of the Eurozone crisis is not necessarily Germany, and the German government can quite legitimately say that, look, we didn't create this, so back off. But there's no denying that the continuing crisis in the Eurozone is casting a negative spell on the rest of the world, and that others have a legitimate interest in seeing that spell removed. So whether pressure works or doesn't work, I can't say. I think we'll have to wait and see. But I think, as Colin and Andy have both said, that we have this process to help resolve these common challenges. And I think G20 leaders would be criticized if they didn't address these problems. So whether it works, I don't know. Maybe we just have to see.
I mean, Germany is not the only country that has been in this position. I mean, obviously, at the beginning of the G20 process at the leaders' level, the United States was at the center of attention indeed. I think the main reason that they called the G20 in November 2008 was to, in a sense, set some different rules and to detract attention from perhaps other alternatives, whether it was the Stiglitz Commission, whether it was the UN process. We've seen China on the receiving end of criticism. It's probably the difference between the Chinese and the Germans is the Chinese usually give some sort of policy response prior to the G20. I think what is interesting at Los Cabos is that so much of this pressure is actually taking place in the summit itself and around the context of the summit. And I think even though Germany is perhaps not used to this type of process, I think we are beginning to see both at the political level and indeed the societal level some sort of changes. Banking union, even though there's going to be all of these open-ended questions about sovereignty, about, again, the mechanisms of banking union, about single regulator, about deposit insurance and so on. This is a step forward. And again, I think this shows that countries under pressure come up with interesting diplomatic responses that show them perhaps in a better light. And I think we're beginning to see Germany in a better light. And I think it also reflects the societal dimension that I think you're beginning to see some changes in German domestic societal reactions from the hardline austerity. The more they see Greece under pressure, the more they see this type of criticism, even though maybe the proverbial housewife is still sort of the image that German politicians like to use. I think German society is very complex and very sophisticated and in some ways extremely generous. So I think we are going to see a shift in some directions, and perhaps looking down the road, Los Cabos will be not the end of a process, but the beginning of the process. The question is just how long this process, going back to the press conference from the European Commission Council this morning, or yesterday morning, if it's a 10-year process, I think the enthusiasm is going to wane, and so I think this is the other very positive aspect, and comes back to the focal group. This focuses attention, and the timeline has to be much more shortened, not just from the markets, but from the political processes as well.
It's a wonderful question you ask, because I think it's a legitimate question. On the other hand, it's sort of that kind of reaction in a way seems to me to fly in the face of the realities that we're all experiencing. You know, you just can't say, look, this is my problem and I'll take care of it, and you stop badgering me about it, right? I mean, your problem is my problem is your problem. We are so interpenetrated today, so interconnected that, you know, everybody on earth was watching those elections in Greece and to some extent in France as well. Why? Because there are impacts on all of us from all these internal political maneuverings. I mean, we all know a hell of a lot more about German politics than we did a few months ago, and you know, with good reason. So I think what we're doing is we're maturing as a global community. We've got to change our mindsets about just because some people, you know, are a little bit, you know, there's tension and there's conflict and there's reaction means that we're actually engaged with each other, right? And it matters to all of us. So my whole thing is that it's a completely, we just have to get used to it, right? We have to feel like this is normal, and we have to learn how to do business in this kind of environment because we are so interconnected.
This is for anybody on the panel who'd like to respond. The leaders came to Los Cabos with a pretty loaded agenda, and of course the Eurozone basically, you know, took over the spotlight going into the summit. But for Calderon, his pet theme from the beginning has been green growth, sustainability, climate change. We're moving into Rio right now, beginning tomorrow, I think. Is that right? I'm wondering if you can shed some light on what you think the legacy of Los Cabos will be, given the laundry list of issues that the leaders are dealing with, and the prominence of the green growth issue from Calderon on the one hand versus you know, the fallout from the Greek elections and the ongoing Eurozone crisis.
as the...
It's a very good question. I hadn't really thought about it. What I think the legacy is, I've been here since Friday afternoon, and I went to the Rethinking G20 conference, which wasn't a conference at all. It was a show, but it was interesting, engaging, out of the box, literally thinking. And then I went to the green growth session of the B20, and I've seen President Calderon in both of these settings. And then, of course, we've seen a lot of them on the monitor since the G20 summit has started. And I think he's been an ideal president and host to this summit, and because I think he's had an ability to range over a broad scope of issues. He's absorbed the whole agenda. He has a way of developing an articulation about what the connection is among the issues and between the global issues and the domestic issues. I don't think we can answer the question about legacy until this is over. In a certain sense, we're sitting here at 10 o'clock in the morning on the second day of the summit. It'll be done in 6 hours, and we know very little, at this point, on what's actually transpired so far. And that's just the way these summits are organized. I'm not sure it's the best way to organize them, but that's the way they are organized, and they have traditionally been organized. So it all comes at the end. And I think he is interested in green growth, and I've been following it fairly carefully, but I've been following it very carefully, to be honest with you. But I'm not sure how it's going to come out. So it's a little bit difficult to say ex ante before this afternoon that this could be the legacy, because we don't know what it really is. And that's the issue that I've been pressing on, is that it seems to me that what green growth needs is a focus and a definition. And with all the pressures there are from various groups with various agendas on the green issues, that's a very hard thing to do without alienating someone. And yet if you don't do it, you're all over the place, you're everywhere and nowhere. And so the degree to which the leaders are able to resolve this and provide a focus for it so that there is a message, it's not just a phrase with many meanings but no meaning, that I will have to wait and see. But I do say that I must say, I think watching President Calderon, who I've never had a chance to watch so carefully, so close for so many days, he's done a superb job, and certainly the team behind him has too. So it's a well-done summit for sure.
I think we have to be careful about overselling the particular issues. I mean, if we go back to Seoul, Seoul Development Consensus seemed to have all sorts of legs, and of course in some ways it's faded, and probably the green growth, partly just because of the complexity and the timeline, is going to fade. But at the same time, I think it shows, coming back to Colin's point, if we imagined 20 years ago that we would have such a healthy sort of debate about issues led by such an array of countries, I think we would have been amazed and attracted to that model. This is why I think that whole G0 notion is wrong. I mean, what we're seeing is the ability of countries like Korea, like Mexico, to carve out space for themselves. And this, I think, provides a model for other countries in the future. Australia, Turkey, that are also going to host the G20. And I think in this regard, we're seeing Mexico and indeed Korea as sort of models of the future about how to hold a summit, how to have this mature debate, how to evolve not just the G2 or the BRICS versus the G7, G8. I think this is a real centerpiece of global governance, with all the warts, with all the tensions, and I think this is a good outcome for the process.
Don't really have much to add. I guess maybe just one very broad overview thought, and that is that, again, going back to the purpose of these summits and international cooperation more generally, I think taking a very narrow economics perspective, it is to internalize, as economists would say, externalities, the problems of when one country is taking a policy action that creates a negative impact on others. Cooperation can help contain that impact. The other real issue here in terms of the objective of summitry is to ensure that there is the provision of an adequate level of public goods, and that is to say that public goods that could very broadly, including green growth, including dealing with challenges like the climate change issue. And again, it's it's very difficult to say at any particular point where there was a breakthrough. It's more of an accretion, of building up, of measures, of continuing the dialogue, so that we do move toward the provision of those public goods and the internalization of externalities. But that's as I say, that's a very economist's jargon answer.
I did think of something that I would, in answer to this legacy question, have to say is, never been to a B20 before. I've always thought that it was sort of an ornament on the way to the real thing. But it was obvious to me, because I was aware of these task force reports that the B20 had put out last Thursday, that a lot of work had gone on. They have several task forces, one of which was on green growth. So I think one of the legacies, and what they decided in the B20, which was that they would form among themselves what they called a G2A2, Green Growth Action Alliance, which would put together leading businesses, governments, civil society organizations around the issue of green growth. And they asked in the task, in the session on green growth with President Calderon there, they asked President Calderon to be the honorary chairman, an actual chairman of this G2A2 Green Growth Action Alliance. And it was a very amusing human moment where either he knew he was going to be asked or he didn't. But in any case, he didn't have a choice, obviously. But on the other hand, it was done in such a way that it was paying tribute to him. And he took it very well, and he said, well, in the next 6 months I'm busy, but after that I'd be happy to help. So, I do think, that I think is this concrete way. I think that I was very impressed, actually, by the work the Business 20 group had done. It's not just business guys. There's some of the people on green growth, for example, were Nick Stern, who's perhaps the best known person on this issue, who for Gordon Brown several years ago articulated a report on climate change, which changed everybody's idea. If we pay a little bit more now, we'll avoid paying lots more later. That was the Nick Stern message. The other person who's on it is Rick Sammons, who is the president or executive director of a new Global Green Growth Institute, which is actually located in Seoul, Korea, which holds a summit every year. There have been 2 so far. And the other person who is on that task force is Andrew Steer, who's been the Sustainable Development Climate Change Advisor at the World Bank and has now just recently become head of the World Resources Institute, WRI, in Washington, which is one of the best think tanks on this issue. So those 3 individuals, among others, were in the task with the business executives working on this report. So this is serious, substantive conversation with the cutting-edge knowledge. Nick Stern chaired the panel on green growth, introduced the whole thing. This is serious stuff.
I'd like to suggest we take one more question in the group setting, and then afterwards, all 3 fellows are available for one-on-one interviews. But I'm going to go to Bill Curry at the Globe and Mail, and I'm sorry, but if you want to come up afterwards and ask questions, or all of you.
Hi there. Canada is expected to be invited today into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I was wondering if the 3 of you might be able to comment in terms of what you'll be watching for as the details come out on that.
Well, I think obviously this is a very good piece of news if it indeed comes about. And one of the messages that I've been working on over the last while, and one of the things that I've been worrying about, is the potential retreat from open, dynamic, liberal trade and payments systems that we have painstakingly created over the last 65 years. And the source of my angst here is that if you look around the world, there are a number of countries with very, very large adjustment challenges in front of them. And I think some of these were building prior to the crisis. Some of these are legacies of the crisis. But there are very large adjustment challenges. And of course, again, I hate to come back to the Eurozone, but there is a very serious problem in Europe. You know, when you look at unemployment rates in Spain and Greece and Portugal, and youth unemployment rates of 50%, I mean, that is an extremely serious challenge to social stability, to long-term growth, and so on. And I think in that environment, there is a risk of protectionist pressures coming as governments try to keep employment or try to stimulate employment at home and prevent the loss of jobs through imports. That really was, the tragedy of the 1930s. And as I say, I mean, over the last 65 years, we've gone through a process of trade liberalization that has created a highly integrated global economy that has produced enormous prosperity for millions. So I think efforts to open up and maintain trade is obviously a very good thing indeed. And I think it will be good for Canada and would be good for the other partners, the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Well, I think on that, I mean, the real positive is that it's trans-Pacific. I mean, that it's not a narrower initiative, and therefore we have Canada, we have the United States, we have Mexico, Chile, and of course we also have Australia and New Zealand. So in some ways, the problems of perhaps of segmentation on sort of narrower initiatives on trade is dissipated. There's also, of course, the political sort of energy that type of initiative takes, and I think here Canada certainly put an enormous amount of sort of political capital supporting particularly the United States. The dangers, as you well know, of course, is I guess on two tracks. One is the diffuse versus the industry specific, and of course here we're going to have problems not only in some of the more sophisticated future-oriented industries, intellectual property, but of course we're going to have the problems of marketing boards and Canadian responses to the pressure that's going to come. If it doesn't come from Australia, it's certainly going to come from New Zealand, with memories of the Cairns Group, memories of Canada sort of playing both sides of the agricultural game, having the large export industries in agriculture Canada, but also, of course, having Quebec and Ontario, feathers industry, poultry, but of course particularly dairy products, that I think is going to be a real test of the appetite of Canada for liberalization. The other, and it's only going to come if it is a successful initiative, of course, is the response of China. We can see that Canada, of course, has played the China card. We can see a huge amount of shift in the Canadian response to China in terms of energy projects. How is this going to play if China perceives the Trans-Pacific Initiative as a sort of a geopolitical initiative? If that's the case, then there's going to be some sort of, if not complications, certainly sensitivities, I think, down the line.